PhD and in education. With her specialization was emotional and behavioral disorder, and she has also worked in the education field in the US for a very long time. So I'll be asking her some of the questions that I have formulated for her. But if you have any questions that come across your mind and that you want to do, that you want to ask, you can ask the questions in the comment section. So thank you, Dr. Kristine Melloy, for joining us. Please tell us about your work and please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Irfan. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this. My current work is with training educational leaders, specifically special education administrators, but I work very closely with educational leadership and policy studies and training principals and special education administrators, directors of special education, and some of those go on to be school superintendents and directors of special education. That's what I've been doing, but my life work has been with training teachers and administrators to work effectively with students with disabilities and students who are in general education and inclusive classrooms.
Okay, great. So since you have worked with administrators and teachers and you're training them, and so I think one of the first questions that I have for you, and that is very relevant in this current pandemic, and we have seen that schools and universities around the world, including Pakistan, they have adopted new ways of teaching, and there have been some challenges as well. So I would like to ask you how the role of a teacher or an administrator have changed in the wake of this pandemic, and what is their new role and how can they adopt to it?
So the role of administrators and the role of teachers hasn't really changed. Administrators are still responsible for leading and managing schools, and teachers and staff and related service providers, and the role of teachers hasn't necessarily changed. They're still responsible for delivery of effective instruction for children and adolescents in schools. However, how those roles are carried out has changed drastically because of school closures due to the COVID-19 global pandemic. One of the things that has become apparent is that some students are thriving in these remote learning environments and other students are not, and everywhere in between. And so there's a lot of things that educators can take away from this and turn in developing perhaps individualized learning plans for all students. But so the roles haven't changed, but how they deliver, how they carry out those roles has changed drastically. So learning how to teach, learning how to deliver services, effective education in remote learning environments is something that everybody had to learn how to do very quickly. Some people have known how to do that for a long time, but for the most part, educators have not, are very familiar with face-to-face learning environments and not remote learning environments. So that's the biggest thing.
And I think that is very true when it comes to Pakistan. So again, the online learning environment and using technology for learning is very new in Pakistan, and even in some of the parts in the US or some of the schools and universities in the US, I would say. So with this change, with this pandemic and the universities and schools going online, a lot of teachers, a lot of administrators, and even a lot of parents have this concern about quality of education. So what can you tell us that has it impacted the quality? The quality has improved or it has depreciated? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it really depends on if the leaders were strong to begin with and the teachers were delivering effective instruction to begin with. That has continued, but they've got new collaborators. The families,
Yes.
We talk about constantly about parents and families, that we need to collaborate with parents and families to make sure that we're meeting the needs of our children. But now that has become absolutely crucial because parents and family members have become persons who are providing the direct service in their homes to children. And so teachers and administrators have had to figure out ways to creatively problem solve and figure out a way to do that in involving parents and family members more directly than they ever have before. And again, some have done this more effectively than others, and some family members have been able to be involved in different levels, in different ways. But leaders who have surrounded themselves and been willing to surround themselves with others who know and are able to do things better than because we can't all be experts in everything. And so those leaders, those administrators who have reached out to their teachers, their staff, the families, and figured out ways to deliver, to deliver this quality instruction even in remote learning environments. Those environments have become most effective or continue to deliver quality education. And I think of one superintendent in one of the districts that I know about came up with the idea of school buses becoming hotspots, Wi-Fi hotspots, and had the school buses park in neighborhoods where children didn't have equal access or equitable access to the internet. And so instead of kids going and taking whatever device they had to parking lots, fast food places, for example, the school buses became hotspots, and so they parked them in the neighborhoods. And not only did they become a way to deliver food to address the issue of food insecurity, but they delivered their breakfast and their lunch meals. But those school buses became the hotspot for, and then the children didn't have to leave their homes. And I asked the person who told me this, one of the administrators I was training, I said, now who came up with that idea? And she told me it was our superintendent of schools. And I'm like, usually a superintendent of school doesn't get quite that, boots on the ground kind of delivery of ideas. But it was that kind of creative problem solving that really was able to come up with some good ideas.
I think, any challenge that we face as humans, as humankind, it gives us also an opportunity to evolve and think creatively to overcome that problem. And I'm really impressed by thinking of parents as collaborators, like you have mentioned, and so it really stuck with me. So maybe you can talk a little bit more about that, because a lot of parents here in Pakistan and other developing countries, and even in the US, I think they struggle with this idea of online education. And so has always there been a role of parents in children's education? And as you said, that the role has increased. So what can parents do to facilitate the learning of their children? And in terms of higher education, what can families do to enable university students who are studying at home remote and doing remote learning? How can they facilitate that?
So what can parents do to facilitate that? I think work
Yes.
collaboratively with the educators who are, really concerned about how kids are learning, or children are learning remotely, and nobody saw this coming. And so not only are parents trying to work from home, some of them are working from home, others are having to go out and do their job as essential workers in the communities. And then, so they're having to teach their children or facilitate the teaching of their children, go do their jobs, and then, for providing childcare somehow or other, either with older siblings or neighbors or however that's happening. So there's all these different ways of solving these problems. So really working closely with educators in a way that they've never had to do before, and that's remotely. That's through the phone calls, or if they have internet access through devices. A lot of people have smartphones and tablets and laptop computers, and those are some ways that they've been able to communicate. Some of the places, though, where persons were able to get access to internet and devices, such as public libraries and whatever, those things are no longer available. So figuring out ways to be, involved that way, but working with the teachers. And, one of the things that we know is that families and parents know their children best, no matter what our thoughts are about whether or not they're delivering instruction. It's not going to be the same way that we would deliver it, let's say, in a classroom with other children. It's individualized learning at its best, I guess. And so to expect that the delivery of instruction is going to be exactly the same as it would be as if the children were face-to-face with their teachers and the related service providers and paraprofessionals, is that's not going to happen. And one of the things that I think that everyone's given themselves permission to do is that we maintain the levels of progress rather than trying to move kids forward. And the one good thing, the consolation in all of that, is that every kid in the world, not just in my little town or my big city or in the US or in Pakistan or whatever, every kid in the world is in the same boat, every family in the world. And that draws us together. That gives us hope, I think. I see a question here. One probably is.
Yeah, so this is from Mia Ali Baksh, and so he's asking, one problem as we as students are facing is staying motivated and productive during this pandemic. So any suggestions that might help?
Well, I think the thing that I've seen work best is do the things that you least like first, and then go to the things that you most like. Do your homework, do your schoolwork at times of day that you're most productive. So if the best time of day for you to do your schoolwork is in the middle of the afternoon, do that then. Or, if it's in the morning or late at night, whatever time of day is the best time for you to do that. The other thing is that I've seen students getting together remotely through Zoom or Skype or somehow with their peers and doing their schoolwork together. That keeps you motivated. The other day, though, I did see that John Bon Jovi, who's a music icon, got together with a group of, I think it was second graders, and they got together and they created a song, I think. But just the fact that I think it was the second grade class. I don't know exactly how they all got together. I don't know if the teacher did it or if John Bon Jovi did it with, called the group together. But I think that's one of the things that we've seen in remote learning environments or, the stay-at-home orders and that is that it's created an opportunity for us to try out new things and be able to meet in ways that we didn't usually have when we're in face-to-face environments. I mean, just like this interview this morning, I'm in the U.S. and Irfan, you're in Pakistan, and you do this before. So I'm just saying, to stay motivated, pick out a time of day or week that works best for you. Pick out people that you want to meet with remotely. Do the work that you least like to do first, and then do the work that you most like to do after you get that. It's like as an incentive for you to do your schoolwork.
I think I would like to add a little bit here that Ali, I would advise that implement a routine because a big role of a university or a school is to help you be in a routine, and the environment is such that your classes start at a certain time. You have to be there, then you are with the teacher. But with online learning, again, you have to be involved with online learning at a certain time. But other than that, also have a routine. I know Ali is a student at Blackstone, so his exams are coming up. So his stress might be very high at this moment. So have faith, Ali, in yourself, and just do your just prepare for the exams and then do your best. And so we have seen that universities are very fair. University of London at least is very fair, and so you won't. And we know that you are a very hardworking student. You'll do fine. I have another question from Taqir Ahmed. It's a bit of a futuristic question. I'll just state his question as it is, and then I'll also maybe ask or rephrase it in a different way. So he's asking, is future of learning fully automated? Will human be taught by machine? What effects it has caused on developing countries? So I would like to rephrase it that maybe you can answer that, and then also maybe talk a little bit about the importance of technology in education.
So there are a lot of things that technology can help with regard to access to being able to do things with technology that you wouldn't be able to do if you didn't have technology. So I think of some of the large companies that have created opportunities for children and adults with disabilities who can speak for them. The technology speaks for them. It writes for them. So they have disabilities or something related to loss of limbs or loss of ability to speak and whatever. So that technology allows for access to skills that maybe because of injuries or that they were born with some kind of disability or whatever, then those things allow that technology allows for access or equitable access, whereas before it would not have been possible. And so technology has its place. I think of technology being able to use the computer to write. My writing has, and I used to use this personally, my writing has improved tremendously because I'm able to use, word processing for that. At least I think it's improved tremendously, but it's easier. I guess it's easier than handwriting everything. And then being able to communicate and share it with others and that kind of thing. I don't think, though, that technology will ever take the place of human interaction. But then whoever knew, I didn't know that the typewriter would be replaced by a computer. So I can't, I envision in 20 years from now that machines are going to will continue to have a big part of our life, will be part of our life, even more so than now. But I don't know that human beings will ever be replaced totally by machines. I think that they will just help us more in our life and free up our time to be better human beings with each other. At least that would be my hope.
I would like to add here that at Blackstone, what we have done is legal education has always been very traditional, especially in Pakistan. It has been very lecture based. So what we have done is we have taken away the lecture and we have shortened it to very relevant aspects of education or learning. And the rest of the education, what we have done is we are using Google Classroom, and we have added activities and group discussions and research activities. So what our goal here is to help students develop those skills, develop the skill of research, collaboration, and we use technology extensively for that. Even before the pandemic, we were using classrooms. So we were using computers in all of our classrooms. All the students were given Chromebooks, so they could do the activities and they can communicate with each other. They can interact with each other. They can do their own research, because a teacher doing research for them is not going to help them learn research. And I don't know. I mean, in the US, students do have this. I feel a better culture of taking responsibility and doing research on their own. But in Pakistan, if you give homework, especially in higher education, nobody does that. So we want to do that in the classroom, and we use technology for that. And like you said, technology is an enabler, and it is facilitating the teacher and the students. But we don't know, the role can increase. And so I would move on to the next question that we have. If the coronavirus situation persists and it is here for a longer time, uh, we know there are some promises of vaccination coming at the end of this year or the start of the early next year. But let's say if it stays here for another 1 year, what do you think? What kind of skills do teacher need to develop, and what kind of capacity building are we looking at for teachers and school administrators or university administrators or university teachers?
If I could I'll answer that question in a minute or five, but I just want to say something about what we were talking about previously. You know, a long time ago, when I first started being a professor in higher education, one of my students, when I first started, you know, this was eons ago, one of my students one day used the phrase, you know, we've moved from sage on the stage to guide on the side for
Yes.
the role of a university professor, a university instructor. And I really reflected on that because all of my training had been that the university professor was the sage on the stage. And when I thought about my own teaching of children,
Mhm.
I was right there, guiding them in their education. And
Mhm.
I thought, well, why am I, as a university professor, why am I not teaching that way with adults,
Mhm.
graduate students? And so I revised all of my teaching to be the guide on the side. And even though it was still face to face, but I was always teaching in hybrid learning environments because our grading and our assignments and things like that were not turned in as paper pencil assignments. They were all turned in through the internet or through learning management systems. So currently, all my teaching is online. And like you said, Irfan, you know, it's a combination of, you know, those small lecturettes. I'm not even sure sometimes if my students even look at those. You know, I keep trying to figure out, have you actually looked at these things? But I can tell some, you know, say things. Anyway, so that's what I would say about that. But that question, if the pandemic causes for sustained stay at home, school closures, and whatever, I think that we have the opportunity to the new skills. I'm not sure if it's especially new skills, but it's an improvement in skills and maintenance of skills that teachers have in the high leverage practices for inclusive classrooms. And those high leverage practices, there are 22 of them that have been defined by the Council for Exceptional Children and the International Council for Exceptional Children. And these are not just practices for children with disabilities. These are practices for all children to be, you know, more effectively taught and to increase their achievement and the teachers and educators in collaboration, assessment, social, behavioral, and emotional learning and instruction. And so those high leverage practices for all teachers and other educators to be experts in those practices through PD, pre-service and post-service, or in-service, I should say. And then that teachers and others need to be highly effective in the 4 possible pathways that we're going to go back to whatever that new normal is, starting, you know, even this summer in delivery of instruction. And those 4 pathways are, you know, total remote learning. And these are the things that that we've been talking about. You know, how are we going to go back to school in the fall or, you know, in August or whatever time of year. Total remote learning, where continued this remote learning environment, a hybrid of that, which is remote learning and face-to-face, blended learning, which is what you were describing, what we do with our graduate students, where they do they learn they get the lecturettes or whatever through the internet and whatever, and then they come together in either face-to-face or more internet through discussions and things like that, and the instructor is part of that so that they can answer any questions or help them do any assignments that they need to do. Or then the face-to-face. But even the face-to-face is going to be looking at a new normal, because until we get a vaccine, there will have to be rules and for distance learning, social distancing, so that we don't go into more of the virus being spread. So even if it's face to face, there's going to be rules for that. But we have to pay attention to CDC and WHO, the World Health Organization, and get guidance from them about how do we do face to face learning, because it's not going to be the same. It may never be.
Like you mentioned, being a sage on the stage, from that to becoming a guide on the side. Uh, I have taught in the US, and teaching it is almost like a privilege, because you have so much influence, and you have those bright eyes looking at you, that you can influence and make them better students, better professionals. But as you do that, there is always this balance that you have to strike, where you are not uh, taking the stage, and the spotlight should always be on the students. And I think one thing that this pandemic has shown is that it has put a lot of focus on remote learning and hybrid learning. So that focus has been shifted from face-to-face learning, and from the role of being a sage on the stage, because it's very hard. Uh, it's hard to have the attention of a student in the classroom when you are there in your flesh and blood. But if you're online, then it's very hard to have that attention of students. So I have this question from Ujala, that so she wants you to ask your input about, so here in Pakistan we have separate schools for special education, but don't you think children with the disability will benefit more by being in a mainstream school? So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, in short, yes. We do also have in the United States still have separate schools for students with disabilities, depending on their needs, especially for kids with what we would say severe severe disabilities. But I think all kids will benefit from being in inclusive schools, no matter the severity of their disability. And there are, we have the basic human right. Every child has a basic human right to an education. And there are documents that have supposedly guaranteed this, including a United Nations document in 1948 that it said that every child has a human right to an inclusive education. And more recently, another document signed by 94 nations that said every child has a right to or should be educated in an inclusive environment, school environment. And more, and the United States keeps trying to say that kids should be in inclusive classrooms, and there's a lot of research that backs that up, that says that that's an evidence-based practice, and yet the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act says that every child has a right to a free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. And that LRE is where IEP, Individual Education Program groups, teams, when they're writing that IEP, they are the ones that make the decision about what is that least restrictive environment. And there are 8 possibilities for least restrictive environment. However, most of my research and my philosophy and my work with children and their families, and with teaching in higher education, and preparing administrators and teachers, I've been working on this for so long now that I just don't even, I don't see any other way that children can be educated except in, with their peers who do not have disabilities, because not only the impact on the child with the disability, but of the impact on the child without the disability. And we know what to do. And when I say we, I mean administrators and and other educators, other education professionals, and families know what to do. Parents of children with disabilities know what their children need, and when we collaborate closely with each other, general education teachers, special education teachers, and other education professionals, and with the families, we can come up with a plan to make this work. And as I mentioned earlier, those high leverage practices for inclusive classrooms are absolutely one of the best ways that I've seen that we can figure out a way to make sure that every education professional knows what those are and knows how to implement them effectively with children and adolescents, and that in higher education is responsible for preparing teachers and administrators to know what those high leverage practices are and how to implement them in inclusive school settings. I hope I answered the question.
No. I think yeah, that brings the focus back on inclusion, and I want to add, like here in Pakistan, we don't have a lot of diversity in our classrooms. Some of the diversity that comes is so there is this urban and rural diversity, and then there is diversity from we have like 4 or 5 provinces, and so out of those 5 provinces, so the students will, if we are lucky to have a student from another province, that adds a bit of a diversity to the classroom. Um, but most in terms of religious diversity, in terms of ethnic diversity, in terms of diversity when people who are differently enabled, if they join the classroom, so all of that, there is this lag, and like Ujala was mentioning, even in on the school level, those kids are educated separately. Like in Blackstone, what we could do as an attempt, and this pandemic also accelerated that, was there are a lot of international students that do a University of London degree. So we added them to our classrooms to add more diversity. So it is more difficult to handle different time zones and having students from all around the world. But in the US, as I've seen and as I've been there in the education field, that there is a lot of diversity there, because people from all around the world come to the US for their education. So, what would you like to add in terms of how diversity and inclusion can help a person learn or become a better educator or a better professional in a general sense?
Just being able to be culturally competent and knowing how to address the needs of every person,
Mm-hmm.
every child, every adolescent, every graduate student, every person makes you stronger as a human being. And being open to how do you address the needs of human beings, and first and foremost that they are a human being, and that's what, as if you're called to be an educator, then that is your absolute responsibility, and addressing the diversity of and embracing diversity as your calling, your you know, how do you get along with others in the world, and what a great opportunity that is, and so it is, I teach in a diverse part of the world, and I go for it. I go there. I don't. I choose to be in a diverse country, a diverse part of the country, and to embrace that, and to model how to be with others. I don't know if I answered your question or not, but
No. I think that how you put it, that it is not just it's not a nice to have, it's essential for an educator, or for a person leading in education, that it's kind of essential to have diversity, and it should be a choice, and it should be systematic, it should be by design. So I think yes, that clears the mind of our audience, that when we talk about diversity, what does it really mean? So it really means that all those viewpoints should be part of the learning experience. So let's talk about, so since you train educators and you've been training educators for such a long time, we talk about this term thrown at us about 21st century learning and the new way of learning, or where we should be heading. So in Blackstone School of Law, we have we have this theory about what the law is and what the law ought to be. So what education is and what education ought to be. And so if you can tell us more about what you think should 21st century learning is, and how it should be imparted into our leaders, or education leaders, or administrators.
All right, and I'll answer that question by going back to the previous question, because what it has to do with is um, including standards. And I don't know about Pakistan, if they have educational standards that back the what do institutions of higher education, what are they responsible for in preparing educators and education professionals, whether they be administrators or teachers. But one concrete thing that we are required to do in terms of diversity in our training programs, for just an example, we are required to have standards to prepare teachers and administrators to address the needs of English language learners. So multiple languages, and that our teachers and administrators are prepared to meet the needs of our English language learners in our classrooms. So that's an example. And I would say that the same as how do we prepare educational leaders for the 21st century is preparing them to provide quality, effective, inclusive education for all students. And all means all. It doesn't mean, well, all of the best students or all of the worst students, and well, the mediocre students, or whatever that means, but all students, and that's all students. And oftentimes we say that we add a little caveat, including students with disabilities, or including students who are English language learners, or all those little caveats, or including all students who are gay or lesbian, or we shouldn't have to add those caveats, because all means all, and all means all every day, every year, every month, all the time. So preparing education professionals to provide that inclusive, quality, effective education. And how do we get there? So it's one thing for institutes of higher education to prepare from an in-service point of view, to prepare education professionals, but also to collaborate with schools and school districts to provide that learning to our in-service person. Because if you went through your training last year, training's changed. and now with how do you prepare education professionals to respond in a situation like we have right now? I mean, we haven't had a global pandemic for a long time, and most of the educators that are serving our children now never dealt with this. It hasn't been in our lifetime. And so even though we know a little bit, let's say, about remote learning, we haven't known about remote learning for every student in the world and having access to that. And so what do we take away from that? And I'll say again that some students are thriving in this remote learning environment, and some students are not. And then there's everybody in between. So what do we take away from that in both our training of in-service and pre-service educational professionals? And how do we ensure that we look at every student as an individual and provide an individual learning plan for all of them, and that our new way of being in education is not that industrialized model that we've embraced here in the United States for ever since education began, where everybody sits in a desk, straight rows. The teacher's desk is in the front of the classroom, and that person is the arbiter of all education, of all knowledge and skills, and the kids sit there and do their thing. That is not, or should not be, it has not been for a long time for most classrooms, most schools, but it still is in secondary education. That's a lot of the way that things are done still. So what do we learn from this? And I think individualized learning for all children, that's something that needs to make sure that we prepare our leaders and our educators.
It seems like a huge task because of how you emphasize that all means all, and that includes people with students with different abilities, student on the spectrum, and students from different backgrounds. I think we need to have more of these conversations in our mainstream media, in our classrooms, and I'm sure you have those conversations when you're teaching and you're preparing future educators and administrators. One thing I would like to ask you is that when in Pakistan we started Blackstone, and we wanted to so it took us almost 1 year after we established everything to start moving towards a more student-centered environment, and we felt a lot of resistance from the students and the teachers. So is that the case in the US, that when you train teachers and administrator, do they understand that it's better to be a guide on the side than to be a sage on the stage? Do they understand that, or is there resistance when you try to teach that?
I would say that if you aren't a guide on the side in higher education, at least in education, you wouldn't survive as a university instructor, professor.
Okay.
In other disciplines, I don't know that that's the way that they do things. I think there's still a lot of sages on the stage there. But I can't really speak for my peers in higher education, other disciplines, and whatever. I do know that there's some movement towards that. But I know in education that there's so much interaction between teachers and the professors, the instructors, and the students, the undergraduate and graduate students. And if you don't teach that way, you won't do it. So there's resistance if you try to be the sage on the stage, and if you aren't, so being the guide on the side, there's not resistance, at least in education.
Okay. So I want to sum up this discussion, and I want to give you an opportunity to maybe. So in our professional lives, we always come across this one golden rule or guiding principle. Whatever we do, if we are lawyers or if we are doctors, so if when you train teachers and when you train them in different ways, and school administrators or university administrators, what is one thing that always stands out, or one thing that you would like to emphasize on based on your experience, and you would like to advise future educators and teachers and university administrators?
Students are first. Students are why you do what you do. So if you forget that, then there's no reason for you to be doing what you're doing. So students are first, and whether that's in the K-12 setting, the pre-K-12 setting, or the higher ed setting, students are first. Doesn't mean that they're always right, but they are first. They're your first concern. And then the other thing is that you must love what you do, and it must love you. And as soon as that changes, then it's time for you to move on and do something else. And there's lots of noble other things to do, but teaching is a calling, it's a vocation. Education is a vocation. It's not just a job. It cannot. If it's just a job, then you can't. Then you're not. You're in the wrong thing. You're doing the wrong thing, and for the wrong reasons. And so, doing the right thing for the right reasons is crucial. So those things. Students are first. Loving what you do, and it loves you, and doing the right thing for the right reasons. Those are some things that I would say.
Thank you very much for your time and for your insights and your input. And I would want to end on this wonderful advice that you gave. And I think we can. So the whole purpose of this show was to add or fill the gaps that are here in Pakistan with our audience and in terms of learning. And so I really want to thank you again for your time and for being with us.
Thank you, Irfan. It was really wonderful to be here. Thank you so much.
All right. Have a good day.
You too.
Thank you. Bye.